This is one of the great things about being Africadia and African Nova Scotian. Our culture, our community, no matter what the oppression and the racism and the apartheid, what made our communities special is the fact that we had communities. We had land, we had homes, we had neighbors who had the same struggles you had, who could share their resources with you, who shared your faith. And all of a sudden, you've got this distinct lifestyle that is linked to where you actually live.
That's George Elliott Clarke, Canada's former Poet Laureate and author of Where Beauty Survived, an Africadian Memoir. He's our guest on this episode of Explore, a Canadian Geographic podcast. I'm David McGuffin. A big welcome back to all you explorers out there, armchair and in motion. It was 75 years ago this month that Black Nova Scotian Viola Desmond was arrested for refusing to leave her seat in the whites-only section of a movie theater in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. Her brave individual protest would go on to inspire later generations who would push for an end to the racist structures that limited the lives of a Black community that's existed in Nova Scotia and the Maritime provinces for centuries. Our guest today, George Elliott Clarke, is intimately familiar with that world. He has family roots that stretch back centuries to the earliest days of Black Nova Scotia. He grew up in a community that he calls Africadia. And today we'll explore Africadia with George through the prism of his remarkable family. As well as being an award-winning poet and former Poet Laureate of Canada, George Elliott Clarke is a professor at the University of Toronto and a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. George Elliott Clarke, welcome to the Explore podcast.
It is so great to be a guest for this podcast, David. Yeah, but it's good to see you.
Yeah, no, really great to see you. So I loved the book. I really did. And it was nice to romp through that sort of territory and through I've lived in Nova Scotia, and there's a lot about that I think a lot of white people just didn't know about, you know?
Yeah, I had a note from a gentleman who now lives in Toronto who is from Halifax.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote me last week to say that he really liked the book a lot, and also that it brought back a lot of memories for him. But he also said what you just said, and he's from Halifax, that he had never realized just how much pressure the Black community was under.
Yeah.
Not his fault, and not his fault that he didn't know about that. But just the fact that the way everything was structured,
mm-hmm.
that we had to do our best to, of course, survive and hope to prosper under that system.
Yeah.
And that others could afford to be completely oblivious.
Yeah.
To that.
Yeah. Obviously, we talked about this earlier. I was at King's doing journalism and covered the North End for a local newspaper, which I think succeeded your local newspaper there, which is nice to have that handshake over time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. At that point, too, there was a lot going on about Africville and reparations for Africville. And so I did understand that history a bit. The things that actually stood out to me as someone coming from Ontario moving down there were, this is mid-90s, Black people being asked for 3 pieces of ID to get into dance bars.
Right.
Mid-90s. And I remember actually having a conversation with an older woman who talked about the slave mentality of the local Black population, and this is why they can't get jobs. It shocked me, yeah?
Yeah.
But that was your world. 75 years ago this month, Viola Desmond was arrested in a movie theater in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia for refusing to leave her seat in the whites-only section, right? Which, amazing that existed, that kind of apartheid existed in Canada. Not to put an age on you, George, but that was just 14 years before you were born. And I'm just wondering how much that world was real to you as a child growing up.
David, that's such a great question, truly. And I had really only vague impressions of an outer world where discrimination happened. As a boy growing up, of course, I had the protection of childhood. Everything's all fairy tales and magic powers and superheroes and so on. So I was at a somewhat of a remove from the actual pressures of discrimination and prejudice and bigotry and so on. But my parents, of course, were not. And so, because of their experiences, some of that outer local world of coping with discrimination, uh, racialization, and so on did intrude into my childhood home and consciousness for that matter. So, your question makes me think about a couple of moments that I discuss in the memoir. But the most important one, and the one that was most searing, and the one that was really represented my introduction to the whole area of reaction and struggle and repercussions and so on, was I was 4 years old. It was probably spring, May, maybe June, spring, warm enough for my brothers and I to play outside in front of our home, which was 117 St. Margaret's Bay Road in Halifax. And so we're playing outside, and three white boys were coming up the road, and they were older than us. As I say, we were 4, 3, and 2 at the time, my brothers and I, and they must have been 5, 6, 7, or somewhere in that bailiwick. So they were older than us, and they were carrying their school bags or school books and so on. And as they approached us, they began to pick up rocks and throw them at us. The hurled rocks didn't hit any of us, as far as I recall, and the force behind them was not great, because we are talking about just young children, boys. But nevertheless, they were throwing the rocks at us, and the N word was coming at us at the same time. I was the oldest, and so I thought it was incumbent upon me to act as the protector of my brothers and pick up those rocks and throw them back, along with the N word. And I'd like to think, as an adult, that they might have been slightly surprised that they might also have been the N word, along with, of course, trying to duck my very feebly thrown pebbles and stones and so on. Anyway, there was enough of a ruckus that my father came to the door of our home, because he worked nights and he was home. My mom was out teaching during the day. So he was home, and he'd probably been napping, and he came out, and when he heard that the commotion, and shooed the white children away and told them to go home or what have you, and then called us inside. And I immediately thought that I was in trouble. My father was very much a disciplinarian. It was one of the problems I had with him, especially once I was older. And so I was worried. I somehow knew that, just having said that word, that there was something about it that was a problem, and that I could be in for a licking, because I was the oldest and I should somehow know better, right? But that's not what happened. Instead, and of course, this is like just so crystal clear in my memory. My father sat us down in front of a mirror, or he brought a mirror out, a full-length mirror, if I remember properly, and set it in front of us. And we were sitting on a sofa, I think, the three of us, our little feet dangling probably over the edge. And he told us, he also brought out 2 sugar bowls, one with brown sugar, one with white sugar. He told us to look at ourselves in the mirror, and then he said, "You're brown. See, you're brown like the brown sugar." Looking at, we're saying, "Yes, Daddy." That's right. The three of us in unison. "Yes, Daddy." Right. We are brown boys here. We see that now very clearly. And he said, "Those boys were white like the white sugar. See, the white sugar, and then we're like white like that." And we're like, "Yeah, right. That makes perfect sense. Thank you." And then he went on to say, some white sugar people don't like brown sugar people, and you should not use the word that they used. So that's a long, answer, and even it's still only a partial answer to your great question. But that was my first inkling that there was this something that we possessed, color, that at least superficially marked us as different, but also made us unlikable by people who were colored white. And there were other instances. For instance, at one point, I also mentioned this in the memoir. My mom and my 2 brothers and I, we were coming home from church. It was a Sunday, and we had a taxi. For whatever reasons, our father wasn't with us, but we took a taxi out to where we lived. Taxi driver was white. Uh, and in those days, as you'll recall, David,
Hmm.
I think you'll recall, the cars, everybody smoked. My parents didn't smoke, but everybody else did. So anyway, the cars all had the little ashtray in the armrests even, and a little lid with a spring on it that would spring up so you could stub out your cigarette and so on, or leave your ashes there in the little tray on the armrest. Now my brother Bill, who might have been 4 years old at the time, was playing with the spring action lid of the ashtray on the armrest of the taxi cab, and it was annoying, I suppose, for the taxi driver. And he leaned around and slapped my brother's fingers. Now my mom was right there. She was in the front seat, sitting beside the gentleman, the taxi driver. He could have asked her, "Could you ask him, your son, to not play with the ashtray lid and so on?" You know, he could have, but he didn't. He just instinctively just reached around and slapped my brother's fingers. Now that was assault, pure and simple. And my mother and my father, for that matter, were not willing to let that go lightly. My father took the taxi driver to court. My father was successful in essentially ensuring that the taxi driver understood that he had committed an offense. The judge, as far as I can remember, asked my father if he would be satisfied, perhaps, with an apology, or I don't know, maybe some funds or
Right.
whatever. But whatever the penalty was or could have been, my father said no, that he wasn't interested in receiving restitution per se for the offense, but that he wanted the taxi driver to recognize that what he had done was totally incorrect. And I suppose an apology was in order as well. So those two instances in my childhood, in my boyhood, were those moments
Yeah.
where the outside world, the larger world of racial discrimination, actually impinged on myself. But I really didn't become consciously or really aware of my existence within a world that was racially defining me and marginalizing me and my brothers and others like us until I was more towards my teens. Because that's when the discrimination became pointed and personal.
Right.
Because once I became a teen, I now become an economic threat and a sexual threat for those who want to perceive black people or black men or black young men, black males in general,
Right.
from those standpoints. And so then I was going to have to be controlled and policed, literally policed, to ensure that whatever threat I represented would never actually be actualized or mean harm
Yeah.
for anyone from mainstream society.
I mean, incredible stories about your father in both those cases. And both your parents are larger than life characters in this book. Absolutely. Like you can see how they produced a poet. Um, uh, and I just, they're both from different backgrounds within the Black community in Nova Scotia. It's a community, you've coined a word for it, Africadia. And I'm just wondering for listeners if you can explain what Africadia is to you.
David, thank you so much for that. I came up with that term because I thought it was important that we Black Nova Scotians of historical presence, holding land and having formed communities, many anchored by a church and usually a Baptist church, have some means of demarcating ourselves that was different from the newly arriving immigrant population, Black immigrant population, mainly from the West Indies, mainly from the Caribbean, some from African America, where most of us originally are from, in terms of our lineages and history, and then very few from Africa itself. So here's the dilemma. We are all Black people. We're all from Africa at one point or another. But those of us who had been in Nova Scotia for 200 plus years, who had come up through the segregation, discrimination, the apartheid settlement of the province, so that Black settlements are almost always located on the worst the poorest land on very small allotments next door to larger, much more prosperous, much more landed in terms of having much more land and agricultural land, especially to work with white communities. So we were assigned, our ancestors were assigned these hard scramble lots, often without even being given title to those lots, and expected to do whatever they could to survive. And what that meant, what survival meant, was they could put up homes that to the larger society looked like shacks, looked like huts, but for the Black community were homes, really well built and comfortable homes for ourselves, our ancestors. But to survive economically, they had to go into, walk into, ride a horse into, take a cart into, catch a bus into, whatever, the larger white community. Again, it was an apartheid settlement from the very beginning. Larger white town, Black village a few miles away. And so the Black villagers would have to go into the white town, and sometimes there were laws that said you had to be out of town by sundown, especially if you were a Black man. And that was true of New Glasgow, where Viola Desmond was arrested in 1946. And it was also true of a town called Digby, Nova Scotia. Their law, they were called sunset laws or sundown laws, which their laws was not changed or wasn't stricken from the books until 1967, probably the same for New Glasgow. And these laws were actually enforced, but I shouldn't get away from the question you asked me, which is why Africadia. So I'm explaining it in the sense that we had that very specific historical origin in Nova Scotia from the very beginning, and the first major Black arrivals coming from the United States arrived as slaves. And these were people who came in 1760 with the so-called planters. And the planters were well, they weren't really Americans yet because the United States had not been born yet. But they were really Americans. One generation later, they're going to have the revolution. So they were basically Americans. And they were coming from the South and also from New England. And of course, slavery was legal everywhere at that point when they arrived. So they brought hundreds of slaves with them, essentially to the Annapolis Valley and, of course, to Halifax, when they arrived to take up the lands of the exiled Acadians in 1760. So that was the first major population of Blacks in Nova Scotia, not counting Fortress Louisbourg under Nouvelle France, where they also had 100 or so, maybe more, enslaved Black people connected to Fortress Louisbourg in Cape Breton. The historical Black Nova Scotia population, dating back to 1760, and then the Black Loyalists' arrival, 1783, and then the Black refugees arriving from the War of 1812, 1816, and then a group of West Indians who ended up in Cape Breton, Glace Bay, Sydney area in the early 20th century. Our experience in Nova Scotia makes us different from all of the other Black people arriving as immigrants later on, beginning essentially in the 1950s. So even though we can say that, yes, we are all Black people together, yes, we all support Pan-Africanism, yes, we recognize that we are part of the diaspora, we also have developed a different, separate culture in Nova Scotia. We are Black Nova Scotians, but then so are people who come from Nigeria and Jamaica and the United States and Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal and Sierra Leone. Once they get to Nova Scotia and they stay there for 6 months, they're also Black Nova Scotians.
You're in.
They're also African Nova Scotians. So I came up with Africadian as a way to demarcate us as a specific cultural group of Black people landed in Nova Scotia for centuries. And governments and universities in Nova Scotia use the problematic phrase for the same reason, to demarcate our experiences separate from Black newcomers and their experiences. They use the phrase Indigenous Black. And that's a phrase that Rocky Jones, who was my mentor, invented in the 1970s for the same reason, to demarcate our experience as different, not superior, not better, just different. and culturally specific. Of course, that phrase Indigenous Blacks raises hackles with some Indigenous people
Right.
who don't understand why we would want to call ourselves Indigenous, since we are not Indigenous per se, except for those of us like myself who do carry Indigenous ancestry too.
Right. Right. Because those two communities were forced
Yeah,
together quite often, right?
yeah, they were. So there was a lot of interconnection, intermarriage,
Mhm.
and so on between the Mi'kmaq people in Nova Scotia and the African population arriving out of slavery or resistance to slavery. And we were often positioned next to each other. We found common cause with each other, and we also shared a lot of cultural attributes. The drumming, for instance, basket weaving, basket making, and the shared experience of trying to survive versus in empowered white supremacist ideological practices. So we had to make a common cause. And that's not to say that Mi'kmaq people did not have it worse than Africadians did, to use my word.
Mhm.
I'm sure that they did. At the same time, I also think it's difficult for us to get into a competition about who's more oppressed and so on, because at the end of the day, we were both at the bottom of every single scale that matters.
Yeah. As I mentioned, your both your families, your mom's and your dad's families, are deeply rooted in the Africadian community there, but also very different. And you were born yourself in Hants County in the Annapolis Valley, which is a gorgeous part of Nova Scotia, in Windsor Plains, which was the Black community there. And can you describe a bit about what that life was like?
Oh, David, this is one of the great things about being Africadian, African Nova Scotian. Our culture, our community, despite the oppression, despite the racism and so on, grew up. Our ancestors, too. I know I can speak for them. No matter what the oppression and the racism and the apartheid and the segregation and the police injustice and blah, 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 the poverty, the disease and everything, what made our communities special is the fact that we had communities. You had neighbors who had the same struggles you had, who could share their resources with you, who shared your faith, who attended the same church, who were related to you. And most of us are pretty much related to each other because it was a pretty small group of people who arrived over those 80 years or so of the initial settlement. So to get to the point here, we had land, we had homes, we had houses, right? And you could go and drop in on your neighbors and you stay over at their place. They come over and stay at your place. Because of segregation, because when people would be visiting Nova Scotia, coming from away, from the US or from Ontario, Upper Canada, of course,
Mm-hmm.
from a Nova Scotian point of view, it's all Upper Canada
All right.
or Ontario. So people coming from these places to Nova Scotia, if they were Black, would most likely end up having to billet with folks in the community or with relatives and so on, right? So what I'm trying to get here was that, and they had land. Now, this is one of the great contradictions of the colonial policies, racist segregation, apartheid settlement. They made sure to give our ancestors the poorest land so that we would become a community of cheap labor, which is how they saw us, how they wanted to use us. And if we weren't interested in being cheap labor, then we should get up and go someplace else, as far as Nova Scotian governments were concerned and settler society was concerned. But it was land. And we got to remember that these first settlers, so to speak, in fact, I'm not going to call them settlers because they had no choice in where they were put.
Mm-hmm.
They did not arrive as empowered people being given the best of the stolen land available. They were not. They were given the worst of the stolen land available, and they had no say in it. But they had arrived with nothing. These are people who were ex-slaves, who were fleeing slavery, or who in fact arrived as slaves. So they had nothing. So when the government said 200 years ago, here's your rotten piece of land, and laughed at them for accepting it,
Yeah.
for having no choice but to accept that rotten piece of land, all of a sudden they understood that they now owned something. They owned a piece of property. When you're a slave, you have no property. You don't own anything. You don't own your children, for crying out loud. You don't own anything. So all of a sudden you're in a situation where, because you're now free, you can actually have your spouse, your wife and husband, to stay with you, not be sold away. You have your children with you and you're under your own roof. Under your own roof. You got a little tiny backyard. You got a little tiny front yard, but hey, it's your tiny front yard. It's your tiny backyard. And no matter how much the outer world is laughing at you and calling you fools and you're poor and you're illiterate and so on, you've got a sense of dignity because these are your four walls. That's your roof, right? These your children sleeping in your beds that you have provided for them under your roof. And all of a sudden, you have the beginnings of a consciousness of dignity and humanity and empowerment, no matter how disenfranchised you are, according to Stats Canada. You're disenfranchised, marginalized, you're poor, illiterate, blah, blah, blah. But you have a home, and then your neighbors have homes. And all of a sudden, you have a community, and then you've got a church to anchor it. So this is a long answer again to your great question. But the beauty of having a place like 3 Mile Plains or a place like Weymouth Falls or a place like North Preston and East Preston and Cherry Brook and Lake Loon and Beachville and Africville when it existed was that you had a community of people who could share child rearing, who could share their produce, whatever it was they were able to grow, whatever it was they were able to hunt, whatever it was they were able to fish, and so on, and keep life and limb together, and also create a culture of music and worship and song, and this is the best part of all, to have a sense of the beauty, the pastoralness of that nature, to see the sunrise over Bedford Basin. If you're in Africville, you can't buy that. You can't purchase that. But there you are with your home on the edge of Halifax on Bedford Basin. You're watching the sun come up over it every day, right? That's priceless. And then you're a Baptist. You want to have your baptism ceremonies. You go down into Bedford Basin. You go down into the nearest river. And you're all dressed in your white robes, and you go down, you get dunked in the water, you get baptized, you get the Spirit, you come back out, you're clapping, people are singing and so on, the tambourines are being beaten, and all of a sudden, you've got this distinct lifestyle that is linked to where you actually live.
Your mom's kind of proof of the empowerment you're talking about, isn't she? Because she came from that environment and got herself through teachers college and was pretty progressive. She ran her own schools. She was a very progressive teacher and obviously raised some pretty dynamic kids as well on top of all of that as well. But then she moved to the city. And, well, she met your father and you came along and you guys moved to the city. And the city side is your father's experience, isn't it? And your father's family is pretty incredible from a whole sort of different realm, and in that they were really pillars of society, sort of even beyond the Black community in Nova Scotia and right back in the early 20th century. Can you describe the White family for us?
Yeah. Well, of course, I knew all about the White family in a sense as a boy, my brothers and I growing up, because our great aunt, my father's aunt, Portia White, his mother's sister, was Canada's first international Black star. I like to time it this way. She was Oscar Peterson before Oscar Peterson was Oscar Peterson.
Yeah.
That's the best way to put it for those who may not know much about her, because she had her period of great fame through the 1930s into the first half of the 1940s. And then difficulties with her throat took her from the concert stage.
Right. She was a soprano, is that right?
Contralto.
Contralto, right.
And she did a whole repertoire of European art songs, but then also spirituals and, of course, a few opera arias. And she also sang jazz. And she was a big enough star in Canada, in Nova Scotia, that the Nova Scotia Talent Trust, which turned 75 years old this year, was created to support her career.
Wow.
75 years ago.
Yeah, it's the same year as Viola Desmond is getting hauled out of a movie theater. I mean, that's the contradictions right there, isn't it? It's incredible.
Absolutely. Absolutely tremendous contradictions. And that was partly what I was also trying to get at in this memoir was, on the one hand, yes, there's pernicious discrimination and prejudice and so on. And on the other hand, especially in terms of the state, the province, the government, and the upper crust structures, because it is an elitist society. a hierarchical society.
Oh, yeah.
So the way it could work is that, okay, the lower echelons of society could be bigoted and prejudiced and so on, and you have to suffer. On the other hand, the elite, the establishment, the upper crust could afford to do the noblesse oblige thing.
Right,
Say,
right.
well, you are really gifted Black people or Negroes or colored people. So, we're going to make some space for you, right? And so you can be the role models and exemplars and so on. And so I don't want to take anything away from my white family relatives who were phenomenal and are phenomenal people.
Mm-hmm.
And just to give you a sense of that, and our listeners a sense of that, my great-grandfather, William Andrew White, who actually is Dr. Captain Reverend William Andrew White Jr.,
right,
was born the son of former slaves in 1874, Virginia.
Wow.
But only 9 years after the Civil War. Only 9 Civil War ended in the United States. And so he's growing up at the end of Reconstruction and what historians describe as the nadir, the lowest point of race relations in the United States, bar none. It was the most atrocious time to be Black, to be Negro in the United States. It was right after Reconstruction ended, and the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and
Jim Crow laws are coming in, and
Jim Crow laws and so on. It was just horrible. So here's this gentleman who grows up, William Andrew White, who says to himself, I'm going to be the first Black millionaire. That's my great-grandfather. I'm going to be the first Black millionaire to show everybody, what we're capable of, right? The son of former slaves. I'm going to be the first Black millionaire.
Yeah.
But then he hears the call. He gets the call from Christ. He becomes a Christian, becomes a believer, and he goes off to a Bible college in Virginia.
Yeah.
Where he meets a white Canadian woman who's also a Baptist, and she's at the same college, and she knows about Nova Scotia. She knows about the Black community in Nova Scotia. So she says to him, William Andrew, you should go to Nova Scotia, Canada, because there are Black people there, basically Black Americans, several generations removed, but they could use you. You could be an important leader and pastor for them. So he says, okay. And so he promptly, after he graduates from Wayland Seminary in Virginia, Richmond, Virginia, he's off to Nova Scotia, where he becomes a student, one of the first Black students at Acadia University at the late 19th century, Victorian era. And he gets his BA. And graduates. I think he was the third Black to graduate from Acadia University, which in those days was the Baptist University in Nova Scotia. He comes out of that university. He has a BA. He's now one of the very, very, very few educated, highly educated Black people in Nova Scotia. He marries a woman whose surname is also White. So she goes from Miss White to Mrs. White without having to change anything, or per se, except the original honorific.
Mm-hmm.
And then he begins to basically build capacity for leadership in the local Africadian, use my word, or Black Nova Scotian community through the Baptist Church especially, and becomes recognized very quickly as being a phenomenal speaker, orator. By the time of his death, he had a radio show that reached as far south as Boston.
Wow.
And had an audience of 1 million.
Wow.
1 million people listening in on Sundays to his great voice. And along the way, between becoming the leader of Black Nova Scotians and the leader of African Canadians at the time, keeping in mind that Nova Scotia had the largest Black population in Canada up until the 1960s. So he was de facto leader of all Black Canadians. But then also, he became the first Black non-commissioned officer in the British Army during the Great War, when he led the No. 2 Construction Battalion.
Which is a very famous battalion, Yeah. The only Black battalion in the First World War representing Canada, is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so then, but, he's not satisfied with those kinds of achievements. He also is busy, along with his wife, in raising a stellar family.
Yeah.
So, of course, Portia becomes the renowned singer internationally. The command performance before Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and of course the town hall, New York, Manhattan, triumphant concerts and so on, and the photograph by Karsh. Oh my God,
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
was just like a household name and so on. Of course, in our household, but other households too.
Hmm.
And then her brother Jack becomes one of the leaders of the Ontario Federation of Labor.
Right.
Another brother of hers, Bill, becomes the first Black to seek federal office to try to enter the House of Commons, get elected. That was in the 1940s, and that was Bill White, who later became an officer in the Order of Canada and a composer as well, and other siblings who were who were also wonderful singers, gifted in music. Oh, I almost forgot another brother, Lauren White, who sang along on Sing Along Jubilee with a certain Anne Murray, who was
Oh, no
also
way.
part of the cast before, of course, she went on to her great international stardom. So, in my childhood, growing up, I had my great uncle Lorne, who's my vice principal at the junior high school I attended. There's Portia White, who unfortunately passed away when I was 8 years old. But nevertheless, was a huge presence in the family.
Right. Yeah.
And so, and of course, there's the knowledge of William
Yeah.
Andrew White.
Just curious about William Andrew White and how much Black empowerment would have been part of his sphere and how much Marcus Garvey and that kind of writing would have figured in, or was that not at all?
Oh my golly. Woo! That's another great question. And I have to say that given the kind of research I was able to do for this memoir and articles and things I've written about members of the white family, my father's maternal relatives, and so on, I have to say that I've come around to understanding that Captain White, William Andrew, was an amalgam of different notions of philosophy and theology, and and so there was a little bit of Marcus Garvey that he could embrace in the sense of uplift, self uplift, racial uplift, that blacks had to uplift themselves. Negroes, as we recall then, would have to uplift ourselves as much as we could also ask for assistance from well-meaning white people who would see that it was in everybody's interest that all peoples be treated equally in a democratic society. So there was a little bit of Garvey in him, and he preached a sermon on race consciousness in 1922, which is the
Wow.
Garvey moment, right
Yeah.
here where I am now in Toronto.
Yeah.
So that's one side of things. The other side of it was a Booker T. Washington accommodationist approach. Now, these approaches are actually antithetical. Booker T. Washington and Marcus Garvey would not have seen eye to eye very much at all, because Booker T. Washington's approach was that Black people really had to essentially content ourselves. Our ancestors should content themselves with being servants uh, to white people until we could become educated and then could begin to truly demand equality in our treatment and civil rights and so forth. There was a lot of pushback against that idea, but the value of the accommodationist approach was that you had a job. Okay, it
Yeah.
was a low level job. It's a servant's job. It's a
Right.
servile job. Maybe it's even a humiliating job, but you got a job. And so you get to earn some money, you bank your money, you start the long, slow climb towards middle class respectability
Mm-hmm.
by starting at the bottom. So that was Booker T. Washington's message to Black Americans, especially, but it was very, very influential because a lot of white people supported it. We're
Right.
saying, you're right. You know what? You should be our servants,
Yeah.
at least for a generation, maybe two or three.
Yeah.
So they put a lot of money behind Booker T. Washington. He was somebody who could walk on water. He had the money. He had the millions just flowing into the Tuskegee Institute. So my great grandfather could see that there were benefits, definitely, to basically playing up to white notions of noblesse oblige, of charity, paternalism. We'll give you some crumbs from the big cake over here, and when you show that you are able, that you have become educated to our level, then we might be able to give you some larger slices of the cake. But it's good that you understand that you have to grow into your citizenship. You have to grow into deserving equal treatment. But that was a very, very popular message in the early 20th century, except for Black radicals, intellectuals like Marcus Garvey, like W.E.B. Du Bois, who totally fought against that idea because they realized that all it was going to do was trap Black people into being hewers of wood, drawers of water forever, 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 and that we would never get equal treatment because we would never be seen as deserving equal treatment, but would just become a race of servants forever. I think, that he had both those strands. There was an accommodationist side, and there was also a Black consciousness, racial uplift side.
Hi, we're going to take a quick break from this episode so I can plug a very important event, the Royal Canadian Geographical Society's online silent auction. You can visit the auction site by going to rcgsauction.ca. There you can scroll through the site to see all the amazing items available, everything from exotic trips led by RCGS explorers to autographed books, art, clothing, and more. All the money raised from the auction supports vital society programming. To bid on auction items, please visit www.rcgsauction.ca. Bidding closes Sunday, November 21st at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And now, back to our podcast. You paint such a rich picture of Africadia. I mean, the book, and I hope you don't mind this comparison, it reminded me of Angela's Ashes by Frank McCourt.
Oh.
I mean, he grew up obviously very poor in Catholic Ireland, a fairly oppressed childhood. But it's an ode to something that's gone away now. And I'm wondering to what extent this is an ode to an Africadia that no longer exists. And what's replaced it?
Oh my, that is such a hard question. And it's one that haunts me because I do feel that I benefited greatly from growing up within what was still, by Nova Scotian standards, numerous communities that were pretty solid and pretty Black. They were always mixed to a certain extent, but they were genuinely Black communities, and that it was great as a teenager, and in my courting moments, in my wooing moments, it was great to be able to go from Windsor to Digby, Lakeele, to places like Jordantown, Hammond's Plains, and Middleton or North Street, and all kinds of places. Weymouth Falls, all these beautiful, gorgeous young Black women of every kind of color and configuration, for crying out loud. And to know that we were a network, that we were a family, an extended family of communities that had survived for 200 years. And my fear now, to come to your question directly, is that, that may not exist, or may not exist as powerfully as it did in my youth 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and so on. And so what's replaced it? It's difficult to say since I have not lived in Nova Scotia since 1987. Although I had made, before COVID, BC, I used to make frequent trips back to do different things and see my relatives, most of whom are still in Nova Scotia. But I would say that the rural communities have dwindled. Even 3 Mile Plains, Windsor Plains, doesn't have the Black population it used to have. And the fact is now Nova Scotia is a peninsula. Halifax is definitely a peninsula, which means that land has become, especially in Halifax, pricier. And as the value of land has grown up in Halifax and the suburbs, gentrification has moved in, which means that poorer Black people have often seen that they had no choice except to sell land that had been in their families for generations, and move to other places. So I am sorry and regretful that those kinds of changes have taken place. There still is an Africadian culture. There still are Africadians. There are still Africadian communities. And I think there always will be, praise God. On the other hand, the kind of solidity that we had around the mainland of Nova Scotia is not so much present anymore. And I think that's detrimental to all of Nova Scotia, because despite all the history of oppression and hardship, Black Nova Scotians are Nova Scotians. We are a founding culture, so to speak, and created a specific culture with our own forms of speech, which grammarians or linguists, I should say, study. African Nova Scotian Vernacular English, to give it the academic title, which is different than African American English and different from other kinds of English. And our own form of the Baptist version of Christianity, the African Baptist Church, founded at Granville Mountain, Nova Scotia, 1853. Right, and as a writer, I love the fact that I can think about people playing prophet, for crying loud, like Richard Preston, riding his horse all up and down the Annapolis Valley and the Cobequid Valley and around the Bay of Fundy coast and the South Shore of Nova Scotia, planting churches everywhere he went. Planting churches everywhere he went. And they called him the apostle to the African race. That's Nova Scotia. Only Nova Scotia could you have somebody come from Virginian slavery, end up becoming the apostle to the African race. He actually went off to London to get the laying on of hands of the West London Baptist Association, right? So when he came back to Nova Scotia, he was the most honored Baptist in Nova Scotia. Black, white, brown, red, yellow. He was the most honored Baptist in Nova Scotia when he came back, vis-a-vis all the white Baptists, because he had the blessing of the West London, the most important Baptist association in the British Empire. And this guy, because of course he was contested by white Baptists and say, oh, you can't build your own church. We don't want you to be part of our church, but we don't like the idea of you going out there, Richard, and building your own church. That's wrong. You should just continue to suffer segregation in our churches, please. And Richard said, he didn't say it, but I'll say it. Hell no. I'm not going to put up with a segregated church. I'm going to go to London. I'm going to get the blessing of the West London Baptist Association. I'm going to come back to Nova Scotia, and I'm going to build 24 churches all around the mainland. So there. See if you can top that.
Yeah, roots run deep.
Yeah.
You've been very generous with your time. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do have a question I ask all my guests, and I'm kind of hoping the answer is somewhere in Africadia in this question. Do you have a favorite place in Canada, a place that's your happy place that maybe you go to when you need to make yourself smile, or that you just love to be at and feel at peace at?
Well, that my mother's family seat, 3 Mile Plains, 5 Mile Plains, Newport Station, Green Street, Windsor Plains, to name the whole thing as a collective. That's it. The first place I recognized as being where I belong. Like there's nothing more powerful than that. You're always, no matter where you go, no matter who you are always what you were first, when you first drew breath. If you stayed there any length of time. And even though I didn't grow up there, I grew up in Halifax, but Windsor was always 3 Mile Plains, 5 Mile Plains was always the place that represented bounty. The outdoors, the great outdoors. The forests, the gardens, the farm animals, the train going by. It was a place of like butter and milk and berries and hazelnuts and stuff right out of the ground, potatoes and carrots and squash and lettuce and all the rest of it. And we come right out of the ground, and then it'd be on my grandparents' table. You can't beat that. It's not the same. You can't, go into a grocery store and grab something off the shelf. Yeah, it's just not the same. So, and then of course you go down the street and there's a Baptist church and everybody's singing, and they're the people from the community, right? Mm-hmm. And so, and then you get the music. One of the strongest memories I have going back to boyhood is of two cowboys, black cowboys, except that they were walking up Green Street, and this is like the mid 1966, 67. They were Hamiltons. These guys, these young men, and they had the horses. They were dressed up like cowboys, for crying out loud. But their skin color, because the sun was setting. It was late summer, or late summer night, evening, and the sun was setting, and the glow of the red sun on their particular mixed color skin made them look like the color of orange pineapple ice cream. That's what I was thinking when I saw them. But these are like two black brown cowboys coming up the street. You can't get that anywhere.
That's a great vision to hold on to.
Else.
Yeah, amazing.
Right?
Yeah, amazing. And you still own land there?
Yeah, I do. It's only 3/4 of an acre, David. Only 3/4 of an acre, but
that's more than most people have in Toronto, George.
Exactly. It's so important to me psychologically, and that land goes back probably to 1813.
Nice.
Probably 1813, right? The black refugees, my mother's side, they were black refugees and Cherokee people who ended up settling in that part of the province, right? So it's been passed down in the family. So I plan to pass it down to my daughter, who lives in Montreal. So I hope that she might have some interest in it. If not, then I'll probably pass it on to the church.
Right.
I'd like it to stay in the family. I really would. I'm so glad I've got my own anthills. my own anthills and thorny bushes, blackberry bushes and whatnot, and crabapple trees. Oh my golly.
Sounds lovely.
Yeah.
Little bit of Eden. Yeah. George Elliott Clarke, thank you so much for your time. And can you tell us the name of the book again?
Yes, the name of the book is Where Beauty Survived, an Africadian Memoir, published by Knopf, Canada, and available at all the right bookstores.
All the right places. Yeah, I highly recommend reading it. I really enjoyed it. So go pick that up. Great. Thank you, George.
Thank you, David.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation. If you did like it and want to help us reach as big an audience as possible, please give us a 5-star rating and write a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. It makes a big difference. Thank you. And be sure to subscribe too so you don't miss future episodes. That's it for this edition of Explore. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, when we'll explore again, I'm David McGuffin.
I think right now we're enjoying very much looking back at the Earth, and it's just a fantastic experience, and I just can't wait to get back and start telling people.
We left Simpson about June 10th with the fur brigade, consisting of a number of yacht boats, each manned by 10 voyageurs.
For us Inuit, it means that Inuit oral history is very strong.
And we flew low over every inch of the country that could be. We were hoping that he would fire at us.